Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandra Barnhill, and I am the lead consultant for the Women of Color Initiative. I am so happy to be a part of today's community discussion. I want to welcome you to When Policy Isn't Enough, Solidarity and Health in Times of Protest. This is our third and our final in a series of community conversations that we really began to help women of color across the state deal with the challenges of the new reality that we're all facing in terms of COVID-19. We adopted the theme safety, healing, and renewal as part of our approach towards dealing with the very real concerns women of color have at this moment. When we launched the Women of Color Initiative last year, in 2019, we were focused on really cultivating a new community of leaders, advocates, future policymakers, and thought leaders, and creating space for them to grow together as agents of positive civic and social change. Today's event is really being hosted in special recognition of Pride Month and is geared toward reinforcing our solidarity with queer, transgender, intersex people of color, QTIPOC. And our belief, it also supports our belief that we are all in this together, and our struggle together must be united, and that is the only way really that we're going to be able to make progress and move together. So with that in mind, while we remain hopeful, we must acknowledge that we are living in a time when the voices of Black women, including Black trans women, are being silenced and their lives are being taken at the hands of hatred, racism, sexism, and misogyny. The shocking and really sad reality shakes us, because the life expectancy of Black trans women in the United States is only 35 years old. We must create change, and we cannot do it soon enough. It is not enough for us to declare that Black lives matter if we do not also wholly affirm and say that Black lives, Black trans lives matter, Black queer lives matter, and Black intersex lives matter. They all matter too. So I'm excited about today's discussion. It's the brainchild of the brilliant group of 2020 Women of Color Fellows. The fellowship class is awesome. The 7 women who were on this work group, I want to honor them and pay special recognition to them. You will get to see their names on the screen, and it's so important to speak and to know one another's names. Our fellowship is an 8-month program that trans women of color, thank you for putting that up. And you see the names: Monisha Jackson, Carrie Blanche, Alexa Yarnar, Michaela Guffey, Zakita Hurt-Jones, Valeska Gutierrez, and Dominique Bozeman. 7 awesome, powerful, committed women who have created this conversation, who've led the creation of the conversation. They're part of an 8-month fellowship program that trains women of color in social justice and civic engagement work. The fellowship is designed to ensure that the voices of women of color are front and center as we build a more equitable Georgia. Now, as we get ready to hop into today's conversation, I salute our moderators, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first moderator for today, Monisha Jackson. Monisha is working on her PhD at Georgia State University, where she's a graduate research assistant in the sociology department. And she also volunteers as a mentor for LGBTQ undergraduate students. She hails from the UK, and from 2015 to 2019, she organized and chaired a 300+ capacity event, Why Is My Curriculum White? Decolonizing geographies with let me repeat that because it's important, you all. She organized and chaired for over 4 years an event that had 300+ folks in attendance called Why Is My Curriculum White? Decolonizing Geographies. There were nationwide presenters and speakers. They all came to the University of Leeds. Monisha, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to say good afternoon to everyone. Welcome you to this panel. My name is Monisha Jackson, and I'm one of the moderators for tonight. Our other moderators are Dominique and Carrie. So we want tonight's panel to be as interactive as possible. We have some individual questions for each panelist based on your background and work. And then Dominique is going to ask some collective questions before Carrie leads the Q&A. So I want to say I'm really excited for this and grateful to you all for being here, both panelists, attendees, and for taking the time out today. So to reiterate, we organized this panel. Some of us are also, identify as queer women. And we wanted to highlight the multiple issues affecting Black and Brown, queer, transgender, and intersex people, both in contemporary society and also historically. And specifically, we wanted to ensure that QT voices are heard. So tonight we will have a number of topics, including the similarities and differences between the current COVID pandemic and the HIV/AIDS epidemic, individual, community, and government responses, as well as looking to joy, resistance, and the future. And we've invited our panelists specifically to share your ideas and give insight on actions towards successfully moving forward in the midst of these interlocking events. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to introduce Tamika Atkins.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the moderators. Thank you, Monisha and Sandra, for opening us up so beautifully. And thank you to the Women of Color Fellows who, I think it's important to lift up. This is our second year envisioning this fellowship to create a new, different, transformative space for us to interpret what leadership looks like for and by and with women of color in Georgia. And just kudos and so much thanks to this second year of fellows who, through much that is happening in our world, have managed to, I think, merge both what is happening in real time to our people, to our communities, to our families, into this fellowship to make it a worthwhile experience, both for themselves and for those of us who get to be, listen, and participate in these panels. So I just wanted to name that. And, when I started the Women of Color Initiative 2 years ago, really the top line, the top vision and priority was what would it look like if we could build a Georgia, build our own agenda, our vision for healthiness, a vision for us to be able to thrive, a vision for liberation that is created for, by, and with Black and Brown women of color. And this narrative has always included our trans sisters. And, when we collected 1,100 surveys, we made intention to include the queer and trans community in developing this liberatory vision. It is important. Any kind of win we have must have those who live the most intersected lives and those who are the most marginalized at the center of any solution that we are devising and building as a people. So now, as we are all challenged, both with COVID-19 and white supremacy, this is the time for us to be talking, lifting up, stepping back, and getting out of the way and making space for our trans sisters, especially our Black trans sisters. So thank you so much for facilitating this conversation and bringing us all here, Monisha.
Thank you so much for that. So I think we will start now by introducing the panelists. So we're going to give you the opportunity to introduce yourselves. If you could say your full name, your pronouns, the organization that you are working with or studying with, and a little bit about your work. And first up is Sam.
Hi everyone. Obviously, you know my name's Sam Hammer. I'm also I'm a PhD student at GSU. I study sex and queer theory and queer methods, specifically for queer people mostly, but I also study heterosexuality and how it operates in this world and structures, you know, the world in unfortunate ways. But other than that, I recently started my PhD, so I haven't really done much in the actual work. So I'm just in the beginnings of that. So I don't have much to say other than that. But yeah, so I'll hand it over to the next person.
Amazing, thank you. If we can go to Antoinette next.
Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Antoinette Jones, and I am an HIV peer specialist at Sister Love Incorporated here in Atlanta, Georgia. Majority of my time is spent advocating for people like myself who are born HIV positive or marginalized folks, people in the LGBTQ community living with HIV, young people living with HIV, and a lot of my work is centered around speaking on those issues, policy reform, and stuff like that. So I'm happy to be here and I'm appreciative to share my experiences with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have some powerful people here. Miliaku next.
Hi everyone, I'm Miliaku Wabweze. I'm Igbo, that's the language of my name. A lot of my work is rooted in economies and how can we queer the ways in which we relate to each other. I'm currently doing my MFA at the New School in Transdisciplinary Design. And I think the word we use a lot is like founder, but like I more see myself as a vessel for a project called Twice as Good Inc., where our entire mission is to build queer economies. Which are just basically different ways of like humans relating to each other that are not just anti-capitalist like unto themselves, but actively destroy capitalism. I also work with ATL Solidarity Fund, Southerners on New Ground, which are both in Atlanta, and IWOC, which is Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. It's all over the United States, but there is an Atlanta chapter that I am specific to. So activist, student, sometimes I work, economist, and designer. And I'm really grateful to you guys for putting this together and having me here.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Desmond.
Hi, I'm Desmond Goss. I'm a professor of sociology at Georgia State University. I'm in Sam and Monisha's department. My work is largely about race and sexuality and gender, but really anything that has to do with intersectionality or oppression. My first book will be coming out in September, a little plug here. It's about race and gay pornography. I would describe myself as a scholar activist. I am constantly trying to merge those two things together, which is always a struggle. But I am so happy to be here and so happy to be in the presence of the other panelists who I don't even know you yet, but I can already tell you're amazing. And so thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. Amazing, amazing panelists. I'm so honored to be in conversation with all of you. So the way that the format is going to go is we have some individual questions for all of you. And then Dominique is going to ask some collective questions. And then we will have a live Q&A, which participants can put questions in the chat or on Facebook also. So our first question goes to Desmond. And our question is, how are QTPOC experiences distinct from white LGBTQ plus folks during both the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the COVID-19 pandemic?
Right, so it's a big question. So I'm trying to shove it into 5 minutes here. But if we know that during the AIDS crisis of the 80s and the 90s, and now during the current COVID crisis, that white supremacy, along with cis heteropatriarchy and capitalism, really just transformed these, epidemiological issues into social crises. And there's a long history of racial issues going unaddressed or even being exacerbated by, organizations that are supposed to be addressing these issues, especially on behalf of sexual and gender minorities. And I'm thinking about the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was one of the first nonprofit organizations created in this country during the 80s and 90s to deal with the AIDS crisis at that time. And the Black and Latinx leadership walked out of a meeting in protest because the white leadership has essentially repeatedly dismissed the needs of their Black and Latinx clients, who made up like more than half of their client base. So these issues are important, and we know that the records indicate that AIDS rates have always been racially disproportionate. Black Americans make up about 12% of the U.S. population, but since the 80s, like 25% of those diagnosed with HIV. And interestingly, over time, we see white men's rates have gone down like 20%, while in terms of their total representation of people living with AIDS, while Black men, for example, those rates have gone up like 20%. So there's still much racial disparity here, despite the fact that there's a kind of group of wealthy white cis gay men who have declared that AIDS is over. That the research shows that it most definitely isn't, and that it's still Black men who have sex with men, and particularly young Black heterosexual women who are bearing a lot of the brunt of it. And so we have good theory to suggest that we need access to adequate health care. We need to make PrEP more available than it is, more or less expensive. We need primary care physicians in low-income communities of color. We need adequate sex education, and all of these things are important and still not being really dealt with. And we know that, for example, the rates among gay men of HIV infection are really due to these issues, but also to the fact that these are men who have a sort of densely social population, and that is necessary to sort of protect from the racism of white gay men. And so white supremacy is working like all angles here. The research on COVID, I think, has not talked much about sexual and gender identities, other than cis women to some extent and cis men. But I think we can think about the past, the history of these issues, to sort of queer and racialize that analysis, to think about public health programming. And so we know that there are already disparities in terms of COVID severity, that even every non-white racial group in the US has higher hospitalization rates, for example, than whites. And for Indigenous, Latinx, and Black communities, those rates are like 4 to 5 times higher than for whites. And we know that that's because of social determinants, right? We know that there are histories here of resource deprivation, food desertification, insurance inaccessibility, environmental racism that makes things like asthma more common, reliance on public transportation where you have, it's impossible to socially distance, racialized mass incarceration, which essentially will, have the likelihood of becoming super spreader events. All of these social determinants are then exacerbated by sexual and gender minority identity. So we know that queer and trans folks are also reluctant to seek healthcare because of well-founded fears about provider discrimination. We know that smoking is higher amongst sexual and gender minorities because of minority stress. That sexual and gender minorities tend to live in densely populated urban areas where socially distancing can be difficult, more likely to be essential workers like food services. All of these things are important. And if we think about the overlap that we have to account for pre-existing conditions in terms of COVID, and we can think about HIV and AIDS as such a pre-existing condition. So there are some communities right now in which these crises are overlapping, in which there's a sort of dual, not just medical, but social crises, right? And there's a lack on behalf of the government in particular of any kind of systematic provision here, which will lead to mass injury and death, which already has. And so these are really instances of structural, if not political violence, right? Tied to this, the concept of social death, which is the idea that, when emergency medical workers are making determinations about where to devote their resources and time, that they use sort of implicit biases about race, gender, et cetera, to make those determinations. And some of you may already have heard about this Black man with a disability who was denied life-saving treatment. Essentially they argued he didn't have a quality of life anyway. So we have to be cognizant of the kind of intersectional context in terms of AIDS and COVID as social crises, that it will mean queer and trans people of color, especially Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks, particularly those living in poverty, those who have disabilities, those who are undocumented, will fare worse, no matter what the pandemic is. And we'll have to be cognizant of that. That's all.
Thank you so much for that insight. Yeah, I definitely, just giving like the global perspective, I'm currently in the UK. And so much of, the same processes have been going on here. A report just came out that showed that, obviously Black and brown people are suffering at higher rates, but the language was very much like, oh, they may be affected more. So it's disheartening. Okay, our next question is kind of tied to this, and it goes to Antoinette. So how has the government contributed to the erasure of queer, trans, intersex, people of color experiences during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, COVID, and Black Lives Matter? This is a big question, so.
Yes, so it's a big question. I kind of like put them all into one. I'm gonna try and keep it below the 3 minutes. So of course, during the time of these pandemics, we are seeing the same thing that we have always seen. So the experiences of queer, trans people, intersex people, Black people, the harassment and the deaths are being like erased and pushed to the back over the past 6 months. So just think about like in 2020, we've only been through 6 months, but it seems like we've been here for a couple of years. But over the past 6 months, we have seen over 16 transgender or gender non-conforming people either fatally shot, killed, attacked, or other violence. And too often these stories go unreported. So that's why I said over 16, because not every experience gets media attention or further investigation. So there's no justice for the souls that were taken from this earth. And we see people use the murder of queer and trans experiences, especially those of Black or brown communities, to further their notion of why the Black Lives Matter movement is cracked, like they're focusing more attention on Black crime rather than finding justice for these folks. We also see the media or the police misgendering victims, which perpetuates more anti-transgender stigma and violence. We see laws that do not protect against discrimination for queer and trans people, either in the workplace or in the doctor's offices, as was mentioned. And we see laws that make it harder for queer and trans people to receive adequate health care, like Desmond mentioned, lackluster or no training on gender identities or misgendering by healthcare professionals. We also see the school system not teaching comprehensive sexual education that encompasses all gender expressions and sexual orientations. And I wanted to bring light to that because I work specifically with youth, making sure that they have proper sexual education. And we don't want to derail the focus that all Black lives matter, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. It's Black people who are being killed, Black people who are being murdered, hung, just for being Black, walking while Black, standing while Black. It's queer and trans people, queer and trans Black people or people of color who are experiencing racism, sexism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, deprived of employment opportunities just because of how they look, healthcare opportunities, housing, and other necessities that they need. So with all of that, of course, the change starts with the system. I say it starts with education. It starts with some trainings, It starts with having hard conversations with people, uncomfortable conversations. I remember somebody told me, like, you're not really making change unless you're uncomfortable with what you're sitting in. So a lot of the stuff that's going on today is making us all very uncomfortable, but that means that we need to do something about it. We want to make sure that we're centering the experiences of queer and trans people, so that, and also paying them for their time. I also stress that a lot. So centering their experiences would be having them on a panel, sharing their stories, not speaking for them, but allowing them to come into the space and speak for themselves and share their own experiences. So, like, in closing, I also want to make it clear that I'm not speaking for people of trans experience. And although I do identify as queer and my pronouns are she, they, them, upon perception, I'm perceived as a cis hetero woman. So compared to my peers, I'm rarely discriminated against based on my gender or sexuality. So I just want to shed some light on that, so that if anybody in the Q&A, has experience to share, to give them that light and that platform to do so. So thank you.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for acknowledging that we had hoped to have Black trans women represented on the panel, and sadly it fell through when we were organizing it. But yeah, it's definitely important to acknowledge, even though we might identify as queer, it's distinct experiences, and we're not a monolithic group. Okay, so our next question goes to Sam, and it's kind of got a lot of different sections, but how has social media contributed to the narratives around Corona and Black Lives Matter? What are some positives or negatives, or is it both? And how do you think this may have differed from times historically without social media?
Yeah, so yeah, again, big question, but basically, social media, I'll start off by saying, is incredibly helpful and incredibly harmful. It also has just made things objectively different, like, and not in a value judgment way, it's just simply different. But it's information and trends and social movements move really quickly with social media, which again, can be positive and negative. And I think that it has helped, like, mainstreamize these sort of ideas and policy, like possible policy things that we can do for a variety of things. Again, for this thing, it's this topic around COVID and Black Lives Matter. But on one end, that's positive. Then the other end, the radical voices and people that are particularly extra marginalized, like in this topic, they're not really heard. And I don't think that the voices that should be heard end up getting in the leadership roles, as an example, or just the ones that are heard the most, or their ideas are rapidly spread the most. I think it's watered down ideas that start off radical and end up not being what the original sort of ideal was. But outside of that, again, like, the positives is that folks can, like, policy can get enacted without votes, without people listening, without the majority of folks being on the page, on the wave of what's going on. Then nothing really gets done. Like, of course, small radical groups can make some sort of difference, but again, in the larger governmental sense, the policy sense, it's sort of frustrating in that it's kind of sort of a double-edged sword, that we have to use social media and we have to sort of be in the mainstream. But when I say we, I'm on a more radical, more revolutionary sense. Like, I use words like abolition, things like that. Versus, I think that most of the mainstream movements end up being neoliberalized, and folks that know what that means, it's basically more individualized, attached to capitalism, more attached to single issue identity politics, and even respectability politics and performative activism. I think that's really the big issue right now, is that there's performative activism going on and things that don't actually change, like writing things, like writing Black Lives Matter, like on a street sign or like on a completely like a roadway. And then the next day, like police are tear gassing folks like on top of the same sign. So I think that like things like that aren't like helpful. But again, it is good that, I'll switch over to COVID. It is good that, you know, things like we can get ideas about masks out, health issues out, things that we should be doing as individuals out to, you know, for public health. But at the same time, bad ideas get rapidly sent out, and people believe it and run with it. And you know, if you know, this president that exists, you know, in existence right now is sending out terrible ideas and harmful things that people believe, and social media helps that, and it's not really in check. Also, again, switch quick over to how it was before, maybe an HIV epidemic like back then, is that, again, we still rely on media, but it's less quick. I feel like social media, like Twitter, like allows ideas to rapidly like things happen, like the COVID epidemic, like every 24 hours, like in March and April, I felt like things were like just like we were living in a whole new world every 24 hours, versus I feel like maybe then it would feel like things could change less quickly, but people still were, you know, using media. And I think that isolated groups of like radical ideas were had more ability to get their ideas across, versus now I think it's more easy to be mainstreamized. Again, I feel like I may be projecting what my experience is, but I feel like that there would be some differences, but really not that much as people would think without social media, despite the quickness of it. I'll end it there.
Thank you. I definitely think, yeah, you touched on like how nuanced it is, in that both things can coexist at the same time. We definitely have seen some positive things come out of social media, but the commodification and branding that gets associated with these issues is definitely difficult to navigate. Okay, our last question is for Miliaku, and it is, since COVID, people have experienced higher levels of isolation. For many of our queer, trans, intersex, POC in non-urban areas, isolation from other queer and trans folks is the usual. How do you think we can build communities outside of physical get-togethers?
Hi. So yeah, I come at this question from different standpoints. I think one of the standpoint is being first generation American and a majority of my family living overseas. Before there was social media, before there was WhatsApp, and before there was all these like different ways to use the internet, before there was internet in the village, like before there was all these methods by which for us to connect over like across an ocean. And I mean, back in the day when you were yelling on the phone call. And I think there's can be a beautiful sort of like returning to the things that we have lost in our culture. One of the most intimate things that I've done either during COVID or beyond is letter writing. There's something, so even if you have the phone number of somebody that you're texting when you are writing a letter, there's something still so very intimate about the process of writing a letter, or sending photos and sharing photos and talking about your daily experiences with those photos is a very, very, very beautiful thing that we sort of like take for granted and don't think about. I think now that we have the internet, we can find people that we're in community with a lot easier. Like, for example, like YouTube tutorials have been a really, really beautiful thing that I know that us in queer community really rely on, and just connecting, being able to go and say, oh, that's how I do that with that. Oh, that's how I do it with that. And so like my partner is trans, and they have many different ways in which they want to engage with their body, and just being able to share videos about this worked for me, did that work for you? And just like using the internet to send that, using the mail to send that, all of that kind of stuff is really, really interesting. I think video chatting is also a really beautiful thing. And I think what coronavirus has done is like allowed us to be creative around the spaces that we get to create and that we get to fully curate. We don't have to ask anybody for rent. We don't have to ask anybody, you know, can I use this space from this time to that time? We can just hop on the Jitsi call, fuck Zoom. We can just hop on the Jitsi call and kiki and have a good time. And I think what we're also seeing during coronavirus times is a reprioritization of connection over like busyness over production, right? So like there's this beautiful question that I love asking about what can happen when people come together. I think right now in like rampant capitalism, it's like spend money at the mall. We're all together, we're not talking to each other, but we all like, you know, shopping next to each other, that kind of thing. Or spend money via Facebook because of all the ads that are coming to you. But I think another thing that we're seeing what happen is that we can remember that the most important thing that we have, the most powerful thing that we have, the most potent thing that we have in revolution is each other and our relationships. And so it's about, I think when I think about queer community that are not maybe in urban areas coming together, I also think about a deprioritization of work, you know, of like having to go, you know, sort of like, you know, when you want to talk to your friend and you're like, oh, I just had a long day at work. This is so tiring. I don't want to do this. Oh, and I have to talk to my friends too. It's like, no. That's how you should feel about your labor. That's not how you should feel about being in community and connection. Because if you call yourself a revolutionary, if you call yourself fighting for freedom and liberation, which I think queer bodies, period, hands down, are what that is. Like liberation is the other, right? Freedom is the other. It is this constant struggle. It is about having beautiful, non-hierarchical, non-oppressive relationships with each other and learning how to do that and being in the process around that fluently, frequently, and always. And so I think the first thing that we need to do in order to connect with our queer brothers and sisters all around the world, because look, we have them in very obscure places, like Bob Risky fears for their life, you know, in Nigeria. Is about prioritizing right relationship, prioritizing healthy relationship, and not looking at it as the chore, as the thing I have to do in order to no, it should be the thing that feels natural, and practice and prioritize that until it does. I think that's my time. Thanks.
Wow, that was beautiful. Amazing words. It's funny because me and Miliaku actually met in the first week that I had moved to Atlanta at a party, and look at the connections that can come. Thank you so much, all of the panelists, for giving your insights specifically on these topics. I am now going to pass over to Dominique, who has some more questions for all of you.
Perfect. And so these questions are for the collective. I'm going to ask two people per question to answer. And the last question, we can all chime in and hear your responses. So the first question I would like Antoinette and Desmond on, and it is long-term, what does investing in long-term change look like when queer and trans lives are only amplified through deaths? And Antoinette can start.
So investing in long-term change looks like everything that we all mentioned, just education, training, and like I said, centering the stories and experiences of queer and trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, all those people, and not waiting until their death, like you said. So don't wait till the last minute. Don't wait until something drastic happens, but start today, start yesterday, actually, and just actually take the time to educate yourself and educate others. So, and it starts with this, like this webinar.
Thank you. Desmond, would you like to follow up with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think Miliaku got to this point, beautifully. When I hear this question, I think about like folks like Ella Baker and Angela Davis, who argued for, radical democracy and for things like abolition and liberation. And all of that was about, getting at the root, and they always use that language about the roots of things. So, I don't think we should necessarily be completely adverse to reformist approaches. That's just between us. I think they're given too much weight. And so publicly we should disparage them. But we still have to always be focused on the eventual deconstruction of white supremacy and cis heteropatriarchy and capitalism. Any reform that takes place inside of those systems will always in some way serve the system itself. And I think, like the two folks who spoke before me mentioned, much of that just starts at home. And the queer and trans communities of color have such a long history of that kind of disidentification, making sense of the context in which we're given. The first Pride was a riot, but it was a riot through which we mourned and vogued and protested. And I think that spirit will carry us forward to the new world that we're trying to envision, one of pluralism and free expression and community.
Thank you. I think there's so much to be learned across, the people of color community and queer and trans community. A lot of our issues are only heightened, right, when something tragic happens. So the more that we can be engaged in policy and legislative reforms throughout, the more our voices will be amplified. So thank you for that. And so the next question would be for Miliaku and Sam. So how do you see the pandemic and Black Lives Matter changing the future of the community, and how has the culture changed during this time, if at all? We can start with Sam.
Can you hear me?
Now, yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Sorry, my mute was on. Yeah, so basically, I think that there's a lot of narrative, a lot of rhetoric going around that this is like one of the largest global movements like of all time. And I think that I'm sort of on that page. I feel like that this may be something that brings about some change. And when I say some change, I mean what I was referring to before as like neoliberal politics, that and what Desmond just spoke to is that it's reform. I do believe that there will be some change and that reform will occur, but I'm ultimately pessimistic for larger things like abolition and defunding. Of course, like smaller scale things, like I know the Minneapolis police were defunded or abolished in some form. But I don't see that happening at all. I mean, like for one, we have, again, this president that we have, it's not really like, I don't really see it much occurring outside of a few things. But I'm just more cynical in that regard. But in regards to COVID, I think that it hopefully is opening people's eyes to the realities of like the social inequality and the pointlessness, the arbitrariness of how we set up our society. I know folks are coming to terms with the racial inequality in a lot of our institutions due to COVID, but I think that they might be missing the mark at some points. I don't even think that some folks acknowledge institutions. I think some folks are like, oh yes, Black folks experience XYZ in healthcare or criminal justice system, but they're not realizing that it's due to the structure. It's from the top down. It's not like, any racial category has anything innate about them that allows this to occur. It's really, the social institutions. So again, I think that some folks miss the mark in that these things will be mainstreamized and that it'll be more individual ideas that are purported versus larger institutional change that we hope to occur, but I'm cynical that it may not occur.
So Sam, are you cynical because of the government? Are you cynical because of, or with defunding the police and abolishing the police? Is it the community's response to it, or do you think our political leaders, are you cynical about those movements moving forward?
Yeah, so I would say that it is the government for sure. Democrats and Republicans. Obviously, Republicans are objectively. When I say objective, I mean in a sociological, social fact way, not like there's no objective. But anyway, is that Republicans are trash, but Democrats also play into this capitalist institution that, again, Desmond has mentioned, that reform will occur through Democrats, but just reform. They'll ultimately work within this institution that upholds, cis hetero patriarchal white supremacist capitalism. So I think that the government has a portion, has a part in it, but also it's just mostly liberals. When I say liberals, I mean folks that aren't into abolishment. They don't use words like abolish. They'll say like, oh, I'm in for defunding the police, but then they'll be like, I don't really mean defund. Like there's a narrative going around it, like defunding really doesn't mean defunding, and it's like, well, no, it does. And also we want abolition. It's really like you're first, like it's 2 steps behind abolition. It's not even like they're on defunding. They're like, oh, well, I want a watered down, mainstreamized neoliberal version of defunding, and not even like really like, so I just am cynical over the majority of folks, because again, I can't expect everyone to be revolutionary. That's by sheer nature of the term, it can't be true. But that would be why I'm cynical.
Awesome, thank you so much. And before we go to Miliaku, I just want everyone to know that if you have a question for our panelists, put it in the chat. Carrie is monitoring the chat right now. And so after this portion, we'll do a Q&A and we can take it from there. Miliaku, same question to you if you wanna follow up on Sam.
Yeah, appreciate what Sam said. Yeah, this thing about like, I want to push back against this thing that policy will do literally anything. Policy are the police. Policy are the vehicle through which the police are able to act and further criminalize queer, Black, and brown and trans bodies. Or like the law is only a tool for supremacy. It is a tool of illusion to uphold control. It will never serve those that it was meant to destroy, which are like inherently the other, which is the Black and queer body, which is a threat to the status quo, period. That's why they want us dead, if not, productive. If they can't, pull us in and make us assimilate, then they die, which is pretty much the sentiment of the state. I don't believe that the government will do anything to uplift and uphold or validate Black, brown, queer, and trans bodies, period, any day of the week. And I think we see some of that distrust sort of coming through in a lot of conspiracy theories. Like Sam spoke to people not really believing the information that's out. Well, they have a lot of history to not. Intersex people are mutilated at birth. Black women are not believed when they're in pain. Henrietta Lacks, her body was experimented on. There's so much basis for this distrust, and this is where like community building really comes in, because we really can take care of us if we want to. So I think one of the biggest things that we are going to see in this shift, aided by social media as well as the protests themselves, is visibility, right? I think with the AIDS pandemic, there was this sort of active effort to stomp out the visibility of queer people, queer and trans people. And I think what we're seeing what I've seen, even when Black Lives Matter was mainstream a couple years ago, 2010, 2012, I'm sorry, not 2010, 2012, sorry. It was 2015, time, feels like we've been 20 for 10 years, like you said, was this sort of silencing of Black, queer, and trans women. And yes, at Pride, I was at a protest that turned into a riot. We were yelling Nina Pop's name, we were yelling Dominique's name, Rhea, I can't remember her last name. We were yelling the names of Black trans women who have been murdered, who our society has murdered. We were mad, whether or not they were killed by police, our society has murdered these people too, too. And so I think what we're gonna see mostly is this big shift in visibility. And this is what I hear when I hear the term representation matters. Like for me coming out, it was really important. Ooh. It was really important for me to see queer Black women who looked like me. It was really important to know that I could dress the way I wanted to dress. It was really important to know that I could be in the world in the way that felt good for me. Like queer Black elders, like queer Black femme elders were everything to me, everything to me. Like it is okay for me to eat pussy. Like it is okay for me to do things and I'm not gonna die. There's a proof, So like this is what I think of when I say representation matters, and that representation is amplifying. And as we create more community around our resistance, that is our existence, I think that we will see the visibility come in a way that isn't representative and isn't reformist, but in a way is like, actually, we're gonna step outside of this shit and build our own shit and take down your shit at the same time. I think abolition is so beautiful because it is both decreation and destruction. It is the same force, and that is the force of love, and that is also the force that is like the root of queerness. that's what I have to say on that. I did want to say this question directly ties into what long-term change is, and like long-term change will take us grounding out of certainty, grounding out of that which we know, and a very deep grounding in discomfort, a very deep grounding in things that we do not know, and like understanding that liberation is a process that is ongoing and ever changing, and like make it the norm to receive new information, make it the norm to receive the queer, to receive the other, to understand it and embody it, internalize it, and move through the world through that lens. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So powerful. Thank you so much. The next question is for all the panelists, and I think it's important that we kind of round it out on this topic. But how do we center pleasure and joy in these times? Like, so often we make the role of joy as, you know, self-preservation. And so in times of protest, why is it important, and how do we center it in our lives? And then I can start with Desmond for that.
Yeah, this is a great question. You know, like I said before, I think Korean trans people of color, our communities have a long history of finding joy and pleasure in oppressive conditions. I think, like Miliaku said, it's so important to find community and support each other. Was reminded of this question of the lesbian feminist maxim that, you know, every time we make love, we win. They don't say make love. I'm not as much of a risk taker as Miliaku, so I'll just say make love. But, you know, and I was also thinking about Adrienne Marie Brown and the idea of pleasure activism, you know, and not thinking about justice organizing as another form of work in the capitalist sense, but instead finding a joy and a pleasure in that in itself, you know. And so I think it's not necessary to separate joy and pleasure from fighting for justice, that we can do both of those simultaneously, and that we can find joy and pleasure in those moments of fighting for justice, even when the world feels like it's falling down.
Thank you for that. Sam, would you like to go next? And then just a note, we can do 3 minutes for each panelist for this question, so we can have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, totally. I'll try and keep it. Yeah, I really love this question because, well, one, Monisha, this is a really important topic for her, and she always mentions it. And my mom is also a proponent of things that she calls little victories. And I think that these sorts of things can keep us going in times like this, and protest and in a literal global pandemic. Because again, this structure of the institutions that we live in are working against us every day. They're not only harming us, they're literally killing people. They're killing Black and brown people, queer people every day. And so I think that moments of joy and pleasure are necessary to get through it. I think that looks different for everyone, but for example, like during like literal protests, like when like people are marching, I look around for moments of joy, because obviously it's, you know, really it should be mournful, it should be reminiscent, it should be historical. But at the same time, you know, there needs to be moments where, like, you know, you're grounded, you're in the moment, and you're realizing you're here. It's, you know, you're here with community, solidarity, all those things. And so I think that it's important for, like, in protests in the global pandemic for HIV/AIDS. Like, I know for a fact that there was joy being had by gay men back then, and especially in as what Desmond just said, is that it's, you know, it's a win when we fuck. Like that's a quote. So I think that that's incredibly important, and joy can be transgressive in the narrative that exists, that, you know, that everything's bad for marginalized folks. I think that moments of community and solidarity and joy are important, and sort of reshape the narrative that people see and hear about us. Because, you know, fighting oppressive structures and institutions and discourses and literal physical people is tough work, but and it's a lifelong process. But I think that these sorts of things will keep folks going and without feeling hopeless.
Thank you. That's so important. And like joy, right in the march, in the protest, from spirituals to Kendrick Lamar, we're gonna be all right, right? Like we're singing that.
Exactly. That song exactly was played several times, and folks were screaming it. So yeah.
It's so important. So we can go to Antoinette next, and then Milyaku, you can round us out for this portion. That's okay.
For me, I just have spreading light and love, as well as embracing one another. I think this is a time that we should really embrace each other, and just support our community in the best way that we can. That's pretty much what I got.
Perfect. Thank you. Milyaku.
Sorry, I keep going back to queerness because I think it is the most beautiful thing on earth, the most beautiful way of being. But and that's in truth, that's integrity. And when we just like are in truth and integrity and can find happiness in that, in a world that is like constantly gaslighting us and lying to us and telling us that our existence is not valid in the way that it is, so that we need to exist as they do. I think truth is the most joyous thing. If even if that comes in the form of critique, if that comes in the form of, you know, telling you are beautiful because you literally are, and like you are, because we all are. It's like what's a body, what's beauty, everything. Yeah, just like being grounded in truth is a definition of joy that literally brings me a lot of joy. And just want to uplift Desmond's words about the literal pleasure of activism. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all so much. So that concludes our discussion, formal discussion portion of the session. We just thank you guys for your thoughts, for your leadership, for your work in the field, and just giving us tools to move forward as a community. And so at this time, Carrie is going to lead our question and answer. So I will give her the floor.
So first, I want to say thank you for just being here, and putting everything in like words that make sense, and basically telling us that showing up means doing the work for tomorrow, yesterday, and in the future constantly. And I think everyone needs that reminder, even though it can get very tiring, but there's also joy within that. So we have a few questions. The first question is for Dr. Goss. If you have a pre-order link or any information in your book, where can we find it?
There's no pre-order link yet. No information, nothing to link you to yet. But I'm trying to think of like how I would get it to you at some point. I have no social media presence like whatsoever. It will be available on my faculty website page for GSU. So check there like September or August. Maybe I'll send it out to some of you just in case if you have like connections, but I really appreciate the interest. But yeah, I have nothing on it yet, unfortunately. It's from Rutledge. I can say that, I guess.
The next question is for Milyaku. Do you have any social medias that you are comfortable with sharing?
Yeah, Instagram at Milyaku, MILIAKU. If you want to hear me talk shit, at Subject to Change, ATL on Instagram, and at Twice as Good Inc. on Instagram, which are the projects that I'm affiliated with. Yeah.
The next question is for all the panelists. And it says, speaking of capitalism, why isn't the movement organizing more about shut the money down and looking at ways to stop spending money with companies who don't support the movement to killing melanin dominant and indigenous people?
If no one's gonna take that, I don't mind. Does anyone want space to take that? Okay, just wanna check in. Amazon supports Black Lives Matter. Jeff Bezos, the CEO, made a press release of a very disturbing letter he got saying, the N-word and all these other things of he's an N-word lover, all these other things, he put a big banner on his website about Black Lives Matter. And I think Sam spoke to this earlier, this direct co-optation technique that capitalism has for things that defy it. It finds ways to absorb it and gets you to spending money. We need to get off of the spending money wheel. There is no amount of money that we can spend. We've made this country trillions of dollars, trillions, because we built this motherfucker for free. There is no amount of money that will go into anything, no amount of money that anyone will spend to bring us our freedom. There's no historical precedence for that. And we see time and time again, like AIDS, like, you know, it was HIV AIDS, it was this huge thing that everybody was ignoring. And then all of a sudden, you know, there were a lot of protests, and all of a sudden now you can buy a cell phone, and the amount of the proceeds that you donate go to this huge foundation where the CEO is making $500,000 a year. Absolutely not. No, there's no amount of money, no amount of engagement in capitalism. The actual thing that it's gaslighting you, it's like the actual thing that's killing you is going to save you. That's not a narrative that is true at all. Now, I understand how in the interim it feels good to not want to spend money with companies that support, but I guess that looks like sometimes it looks like your local co-op, sometimes it looks like your friend on Instagram, and just like trying to support those folks as much as you can. And then also rethinking your relationship with consumption itself, I think is really, really important. And I can't guide that for anyone. I don't believe in that, but I do think it is an important thing to, as we interrogate our relationships to our gender and our sexuality, we also need to interrogate our relationship to spending money.
Does anyone else want to share?
I'll just add, I second all of that. There was this fleeting moment in this, I guess we can call it like the second wave of Black Lives Matter, where, you know, it looked like at least white liberalism was hopping on board this train. And then I saw the Black Lives Matter banner on Amazon. And I thought, okay, well, oh, never mind. You know, Black Lives Matter, it's been Kanye, it's over, you know, it's done. And, you know, and what's funny is that Black Lives Matter was always like the lowest bar possible. You know, that's like, we're just trying to, you know, we want you to get here first, but that's not the end, you know? And so I think like all of us have said that there's, to go back to answer the question, I'm not sure which movement is being referred to, but I think that Black Lives Matter has always been anti-capitalist, at least in its sort of, at its core, you know, not in terms of white liberalism, who have sort of co-opted or appropriated the rhetoric at least, but the concept of Black Lives Matter in terms of radical philosophy, I think has always been anti-capitalist. At the same time, I think, you know, I mean, when I was young and I was like just coming into activism and, you know, I don't know, maybe I was more radical, I hope not, but, you know, I was involved in this protest of Walmart, and the idea, my idea was that Walmart needs to close, you know, which I still agree with, but I had not thought about like, I had not envisioned the roots of the problem. You know, I had not envisioned how many people would be unemployed. And since we have a neoliberal, like Sam said, governmental system, which relies wholly on employment for subsistence, what does that mean? And so we always have to be cognizant of pulling at these issues from their roots. I love what Miliaku said about reevaluating our relationship to consumerism itself. That it's such a difficult task, for me at least. You know, someone I think who preaches anti-capitalism, but I still have to constantly remind myself about my relationship to it, and it's so important. But I think to the commenter, the person who posed the question, I think the core of Black Lives Matter is always anti-capitalist in terms of intersectionality, that we can't separate the oppression of Black people from capitalist oppression, from the oppression of cis heteropatriarchy. They're always interconnected. And so the deconstruction of one will necessarily mean the deconstruction of the other. And we'll have to fight those things on common ground always.
Thank you, Desmond. I would like to go to Sam.
Okay. I just want to say that there's like, just first, that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. You can't do it. So I don't, like, I guess the goal would be moot, unfortunately, to find a better company. Like, of course, like the best you could do is what Miliaku said, is local shops, co-ops, worker owned businesses, worker owned, like democratically owned sort of things. Otherwise, yeah, you're kind of out of luck. But like, as Desmond said, you have to like sort of grapple with, reconcile the material reality of what you live in. So like, you can't, like, you know, shutting down Walmart will like leave so many people unemployed. That's just one example. But so I guess, yeah, you would just do your best. I guess it is basically, excuse me, is the conclusion, is you would do your best. And that is doing what I guess the commenter said, is choosing what you can. But what I will say is, if it's a large global corporate conglomerate, yeah, it's not really like I don't know. Like, I still use Amazon, admittedly. I still use you know, things when it's convenient, like a Kroger, like it's down the street from my house. Like, there's no escaping it at all. So I guess you would just do your best. So when I say the goal is moot, that's mostly theoretical. You would do your best in practice.
So the last and final question that I would like to start off with Antoinette. And it is, what are your visions for abolition in the context of unemployment, evictions, and social disconnection caused by the pandemic?
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
In the context of unemployment, evictions, social disconnection, sorry for the thunder, social disconnection caused by the pandemic.
So my vision is in hopes for togetherness and support. As Miliaku said, just an uprising of Black businesses, uprising of Black support services, and all types of things that reflect and look like people like us. This way we don't have to put our money or finances or anything towards anything that doesn't benefit us. So I see togetherness, I see change. I see us all doing the part that we need to do. So yeah.
Okay, I think Carrie might have got caught with the thunder. Did anyone else want to add to this? All good if not.
No, I definitely want to add to this. I think this is a brilliant question. Did anyone want to go first? Tam, did you want to talk? I saw you. Okay. I think this is the perfect time for abolition, right? So it's like, this is a time where we get to sort of play and imagine outside of everything that we've always known, because that job you thought was so secure went like that. That healthcare you thought you had ain't there no more. That ability that you thought you had to just do whatever, it's sort of like trauma. It's like your whole perception of the world has been disrupted. So I think it's a beautiful, slim opportunity to show everyone what could be possible. You know, this is the time for Black feminist imagination to thrive. Like, we've been writing and reading about this for decades, and this is the time. What does it look like to share housing? What does it look like to abolish ownership? I don't own my house with my partner and my family, like a lot of queer people sort of like mimic straight family, you know, sort of structures. What does it look like that we all sort of group, you know, group together and occupy a home? Like, I'm in Oakland right now, like Moms for Housing did, and we're just taking it and living in it. Like who gonna check us, boo? It's coronavirus times, ain't no evictions, you know. So it's like this is about the time where I think if we did have the relationships and had done the actual organizing work necessary, not just receiving donations and money to pay our salaries, but had done the organizing, the relationship building necessary, we would have the trust necessary to sort of play around with the different ways in which we could fight for freedom, to resist our landlords, to not pay rent. You know, I'm out here with the East Bay Prec. They have all this land with no landlords. How do they do that? You know, like talk to other projects and to see how they've been doing this before the coronavirus. I think it would be really, really dope to think about occupying empty buildings in neighborhoods that like such as Capitol View in Atlanta, or that are more dilapidated, and like what does it look like for the community to come together and forget whoever owns that building, work on the building and set up a community center with a recording studio and a fitness center. What does it look like that, you know, they're starting a garden right now in the Wendy's Autonomous Zone? What does it look like to you know, to be growing our own food and eating it and not being like, oh, you have to pay for this food, you have to buy this food? It's like, no, we're growing it and we're eating it together, real mutual aid in real time. So those are some of the more concrete visions that I have at this time. And I think the disruption, it allows people to say, oh, I can't actually depend on the state and its markets to take care of me, but I can depend on my neighbor because they gave me food from their garden when I didn't have any money. You know, they helped build up this, you know, make up this house and build up this house with me so that we could live here and sleep here and raise our children here. So it's just about taking advantage of that time.
Wonderful, thank you. Anybody else? Sam, Desmond?
Can you repeat the question? I only heard the first part of it in the beginning.
Yes. It was, what are your visions for abolition in the context of unemployment, evictions, social disconnection caused by the pandemic?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, and again, talking in theory is super easy. I mean, just abolish it all, like abolish rent, like abolish it all, like just have everyone live in a house, like that we have more houses open available than there are like homeless folks. Like everyone can just live. Like we could, if the government, if we just wanted to, as a society, structure ourselves in a different way, like Miliaki was saying, like with mutual aid, like with just taking care of ourselves, we should, but we don't due to, you know, just hetero patriarchal white supremacist capitalism. But I digress. But like, yeah, so I think that it just is like we could just do it all, I guess, is what COVID has, I hope, realized for folks, that everything is sort of arbitrary. The government gave us $1,200, like, and if you look at other countries, the number is different. It's monthly, XYZ, like it's all arbitrary. Like they gave $1 trillion bailouts to corporate conglomerates. Like we don't have to do that. So I think that like what are my visions? I mean, it's just the whole, just fucking change everything. But I know that like that's not how life works. So it would just be, you know, what are the tools we have in our society is working with the voting system and policies, even though we know reform is trash and like only works to benefit the system in the end and keep it going. But so, you know, you have to reconcile, you know, do you vote? Do you not vote? Do you, you know, fight? You know, are you part of an organization that has a small co-op that helps a local, you know, your local community? And is that what you know, justify or rationalize as it? Or do you just, you know, are you voting? Are you working within the system? I don't know. I want to do it all, but again, theoretically, it's easy to speak about, I guess.
Thank you so much. Yes, I definitely share your sentiments, as you know. So we've kind of touched on this, but just explicitly, someone asked that they're interested to hear people's opinions on whether you think that COVID provided the necessary pause that kind of facilitated the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and also an increased openness to understanding and pushing for cutie pop rights and justice. This can go to anyone. Everyone's very polite.
So Manisha, is the question that the pandemic provided an opportunity for Black Lives Matter, I guess?
Yeah, essentially, do you think we would have still seen this? Like, do you think this kind of, yeah, facilitated this push?
Right. I think more than COVID, it was, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of the sort of political structures that are in place to make this happen. I mean, and realistically, the movement didn't stop. It may have fell out of, you know, mainstream media favor, but it was still going before COVID. Perhaps there was some, I don't know, if I'm being really pessimistic, I guess I could see how certain governments, especially those who were too quick to reopen, may have seen some opportunity to shift focus to the recent murders of Black and brown folks, away from their problematics of opening, which also harm those same people. But I think largely, no, I think the Black Lives Matter was always going as a movement, even before COVID. And if anything, I think what I've seen, at least what I've observed, is the federal government particularly weaponizing COVID against the Black Lives Matter movement. And trying to, for example, argue that public gatherings will somehow mean more exposures, which we know now that that did not, was not the case. Reopening too soon certainly was. So yeah, I think if anything, what we've seen in terms of the Trump administration and particularly red state governments is, well, metaphorically weaponizing. But also, you know, there's these reports of literally weaponizing, having people not be able to enter a Capitol building with a face mask or whatever else because of facial recognition or whatever else, or so people are reluctant to go out and protest, or, you know, there are some reports of the police like pulling off face masks or, you know, coughing in people's faces and all this sort of antagonistic behavior. So, and even if that's not, even if these are just one-off experiences, just the threat of that is enough, I think, to keep folks inside. Will, you know, rightfully, that it makes sense to be afraid of the ways in which the government will weaponize a pandemic against a community of people who, like Miliaku said, if it cannot make you productive, you know, we see this constant, you know, it's an idea of post-colonial theory, this constant swing between productivity and elimination. And so if we cannot make you productive, then the swing of social control moves toward elimination and then back and forth. And so COVID was just a use of that. If you don't want to be productive, if you refuse to be productive, then we can weaponize something to eliminate you. And I think that's what we see. I don't think it's a coincidence that there was this move towards reopening right around the time we realized which communities were going to be most victimized by the pandemic, right? That those two discourses went hand in hand, unfortunately.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I just wanted to say in the UK, I know like a lot of the time you don't hear the news about like what's going on in the UK, but there was a case where someone had actually said that they had COVID and like spat on a Black woman who was I think she was working in the rail industry, Belly Majinga, and she passed away. So much of like the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK were highlighting her name and calling for justice in that sense. Did anyone else want to address this question? All good if not.
Anyone want to, like, I just want to, go ahead, if anyone wants to say anything. I definitely agree with Desmond, but I do want to say one thing that I have, like, so I've had to, basically I was working at the time right before COVID. Like I've had a job, like that working has just been my life. And so I've not been able to do a lot of protesting because of work, historically in the last like 6 years. And when I was unemployed, all of a sudden, I was like, well, here it is. And so I was able to go protest pretty much every day for a while. And without not working, that would have not been the case. So while I do, like, obviously Desmond is 100% correct in that the movement has always existed, and white folks just weren't following it. It's just the bottom line. But I think that the amount of bodies can be attributed to the fact that like a lot of like working class folks weren't working. Of course, some were still, but like some restaurants are open. For example, like I was a server, most are closed at the time anyway, not anymore. But so I just think that like it may have helped with the amount of bodies in the protest, but other than that, I think that it wasn't really give an opportunity for the actual movement. It was always there, like Desmond said.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to end on, if you could spend like 30 seconds answering, if you could radically reimagine all parts of our societal and economic infrastructure, what would the future look like for you? So keep it brief somehow. Antoinette, do you mind going first?
I would have to say all things Black and Black liberation. Everything that has to do with us, that centers us, centers our experiences, values us, would have to be what I envision. Whether it's schools, education, services, stuff that we need to thrive. So.
Thank you, Desmond.
I 100% agree with Antoinette. All things Black, all things communist, all things queer, all things feminist. Just if we can center those folks that are multiply marginalized, if we can continue to center poor, trans, undocumented women of color with disabilities or whatever else, and use all of our resources and our tools and our knowledge to support them. Everybody's free, that's the Black feminist maxim. And so that's what liberation looks like to me. A world where I don't have to go to work, and I don't have to pay my student loans. And when I do work, I work for the thing that I want to do, and I love freely.
Thank you so much. Miliaku and then Sam.
30 seconds, my life's work in 30 seconds. Yeah, the establishment of the commons, the abolishment of ownership, the abolishment of the state, living in decentralized, autonomous community, and internationally, like hopefully like our little project will connect with the Zapatistas in Rojava and the resistance in Palestine. And it's a nice little mycelium network to decompose, that we create, creation, destruction thing, that we create in order to dissolve the status quo and the world in which we are suffering and surviving, and switch to a world in which we are thriving.
Yeah, I just want to basically uplift what everyone else has said. They've nailed it all. I can't really say it differently. Desmond said it, Black feminist maxim, Black feminist epistemology, with a dash of queer theory in there. I would love to see that. But yeah, a little sprinkle, Miriaku. But yeah, basically I would just say is read fiction, nonfiction. My friend is really pushing fiction on me. Do all these things, center marginalized folks, et cetera, et cetera. I can't really say much else, but if you're into academia, I would throw yourself into some theory, and then go from there, and then do some praxis, do some actual activist work. If you're not so much into academia, that's okay. Like I said, go to fiction and then do some praxis work, do some activism from there, whatever that means for you in a local context.
Thank you so much. You all did amazingly at making that succinct somehow. This has been so wonderful. I'm so grateful to all of you for sharing your words, your ideas, your time, energy, labor with us. So yeah, thank you. And I will pass it over to Tamika to close us out.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank y'all again for taking the time today to share all of your brilliant wisdom, your expertise, your knowledge, your pearls with all of us on this call, and for those who are going to watch this recording in the future. I have 4 to 5 minutes. I will do my best to keep it to 4 to 5 minutes. I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge, because we didn't really pause in the middle of the panel. So I want to pause now to acknowledge and lift up what Antoinette said. It matters that we do not have any Black trans women on this panel. That matters. This is an opportunity for those of us women of color who were a part of making this panel come through, making it happen, to do our own, I think, assessment and evaluation, right? What is the outcome? And if the voices that we're looking to amplify aren't here, how do we then pivot, right, in a way that we can still be authentic in the work and the messages we want to communicate, but also do we need to do something different? It's really hard sometimes when you got the energy going to stop, but sometimes you just need to stop. And it matters that we don't have Black trans women on this panel. And I just want to make sure that it's understood that was heard. And this is a moment for us to do something different and better and pivot. I also want to take a moment just to speak some of the names that were already spoken on the panel, from Monica Diamond to Lexi, to Penelope Diaz-Ramirez, to Nina Pop, to Rhea Milton, to Selena Hernandez, and many, many other Black and brown trans women who have lost their life in 2020 alone. And just have a moment for that. I think it matters. And I think it gives us what is on the horizon, that the leadership of Black Lives Matter, or the creators, right, of Black Lives Matter, because they intentionally have a decentralized leadership model, that they are comprised of majority queer Black women. I think it matters. And it's going to allow us, I want to believe, to get to the vision that all of you have spoken about so eloquently. I lift up in particular Miliaku, and like, how is it that we can queer our relationships to each other? And how do we separate ourselves from capitalism and patriarchy? It matters then that the movement for Black lives, that their leadership is majority queer and trans and gender nonconforming leaders. Because we are Georgia-based and Atlanta-based, I want to name organizations that I'd love for people to donate to, either your time, your money, your knowledge, whatever you can. Solutions Not Punishment Coalition, who have been around for at least a decade and is led by Black trans women. Legender, Miss Dee Dee Lamore has been doing this work. Southern Fried Queer Pride, an amazing space for young Black, queer, and trans leaders of color in Atlanta and in Georgia. I want to name that a lot of our mutual aid efforts that are happening here in Atlanta and other parts of the state are led by Black, queer, and trans women. This matters. And the last thing that I want to say before I go to what I was supposed to say, right, is that as a cishet Black single mother with 2 children, 2 years ago, I read Revolutionary Mothering, and it's an anthology that's been edited by, I'm gonna get, I don't know if all of them, but definitely Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And one of the articles, one of the stories in there is written by June Jordan. And they talk about mothering in a way that leads to Black liberation. And I'm doing a terrible summary. But mothering in a way that allows our children to grow up liberated and free. We are queering motherhood in raising our children to be liberated. And I just want to put that in here somehow too. A New Politics of Sexuality is the name of the article. So my official closing remarks, I want to give a big thank you to our panelists and our moderators. I want to thank Monisha, Dominique, and Carrie. You all did the work. This was an amazing panel with some very thought-provoking questions. We didn't get an opportunity to, I think, say a little bit about our other two facilitators, but Dominique received her JD from Loyola University and is also an entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of Skin Deep Body Care, which is available at Whole Foods, which me, my mom, my friend, and my other friend, we've all purchased your products. They are amazing. Dominique also does a lot of volunteer work using her legal skills to provide information on people's legal rights. And she's a long-term champion of restorative justice. Carrie, who we lost due to the storms, there's a lot of storms happening here, is an anthropology major at Georgia State University, where she's the president of the Student Advocates for Food Equity and has been active in the Reproductive Justice Leadership Institute. We did reach out to Carrie to make sure that they're okay with the storm. So just for y'all to know that they're doing well. And a big thank you to the entire work group that put this event together. And a huge thank you to the Women of Color Initiative 2020 Fellowship overall. Thank you to everybody who took the time to come and participate, listen, ask some deep, thought-provoking questions in the Q&A. At the end of this, before you sign off, we'd love to have you fill out an evaluation form because we can only do better if we get the feedback, right? So that we can continue to reinvent, to sharpen, to do better in all of our work. In all of our panels, we've asked that if you have lost a loved one to COVID-19, if you've had friends or family members who have departed just before their time during the uprisings from February till now, we invite you to pay tribute to them on our wall of remembrance. It's on our website, www.womenofcolorinitiative.org. We also invite you to take part in our Summer of Self-Care. We are doing weekly 1-hour self-care classes on Tuesdays from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. This matters to us. When we started the Women of Color Initiative roughly 2 years ago, we were really committed to building an agenda, both an agenda about how we want to live in Atlanta, how we want to live in Georgia. Also what our policy recommendations, demands would be for the state that best serve and meet the needs of women of color. And with everything that has happened this year, our focus has been on how do we heal and how do we renew and how do we rest up, because this is a long fight. And so we are investing in the self-care of ourselves and other women of color. So please participate in the Summer of Self-Care. And I guess, the last thing is that none of us are free until we're all free. Thank y'all so much for bringing your most authentic self to this panel. We greatly appreciate it. And everybody have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.